The gavel slammed, echoing like a gunshot through the courtroom, but Marcus Wright didn't flinch. He stood tall, his dark eyes locked on Judge Harold Grayson, a man whose sneer seemed carved into his face. This wasn't just a trial, it was a battlefield, and Marcus was about to learn how deep prejudice could cut. Marcus Wright, a 38-year-old federal prosecutor, had walked into the small-town courthouse in Ellison County that morning expecting a routine day. He was there to observe a case, not to become the center of one. Ellison, a sleepy town in Georgia, wasn't known for progress. Its courthouse, with peeling paint and creaky wooden floors, felt like a relic of a bygone era one Marcus had hoped was fading. He'd grown up in places like this, where his skin color often spoke louder than his words. But today, he was a man of the law, a federal prosecutor with a reputation for dismantling corruption with surgical precision. His suit was crisp, his briefcase polished, and his mind sharp. Yet none of that seemed to matter the moment he opened his mouth. It started with a simple question. Marcus had raised his hand during a lull in the proceedings, addressing the judge with the respect he'd earned through years of practice. "Your Honor, may I inquire about the scheduling of the next hearing?" His voice was calm, professional, the kind that commanded attention in D.C. courtrooms. But here, in Ellison, it was met with a scowl. Judge Grayson leaned forward, his glasses glinting under the fluorescent lights. "Who do you think you are, interrupting my court?" he barked, his southern drawl thick with disdain. Marcus blinked, caught off guard. "I'm Marcus Wright, Your Honor," an attorney observing. Grayson cut him off. "I don't care who you are. You don't speak unless spoken to. $50 fine for contempt." The courtroom gasped. Marcus felt the air shift, a collective inhale from the sparse audience, mostly locals, a mix of curious retirees and a few reporters sniffing out small-town drama. He stood frozen, his jaw tight. Contempt? For asking a question. He'd faced hostile judges before, but this was different. This wasn't about procedure. This was personal. He could feel it in the way Grayson's eyes lingered on him, in the way the word, boy, seemed to hang unspoken in the air. Marcus wasn't a stranger to racism, but to have it wielded so brazenly, from the bench no less, lit a fire in his chest. He tried again, his voice steady but firm. "Your Honor, I'm a federal prosecutor with the U.S. Attorney's Office. I have a right to address the court." The words hung there, a challenge wrapped in decorum. Grayson's face reddened, his jowls quivering. "You think you're special because you're some big-shot lawyer? This is my courtroom, and you'll shut up or pay more. Another $100. The gavel slammed again, each strike a hammer to Marcus's dignity. Whispers rippled through the room. A young black woman in the back, clutching a notebook, scribbled furiously. A white man in overalls smirked, leaning toward his neighbor to mutter something Marcus couldn't hear but could guess. Marcus's hands clenched at his sides. He wanted to shout, to lay bare the injustice unfolding before everyone. But he knew better. He'd learned long ago that anger from a black man in a room full of white faces was a weapon they'd turn against him. So he stood taller, his silence louder than any outburst. Inside, though, his mind raced. This wasn't just about him. It was about every person who'd ever been silenced, every voice dismissed because of their skin. He'd fought too hard through law school, through late nights at the Justice Department, through a system that often seemed rigid to let this go unanswered. The tension in the courtroom thickened as the morning wore on. Grayson moved through other cases, but his eyes kept darting to Marcus, daring him to speak again. Marcus didn't. Not yet. He sat, his notepad untouched, his mind mapping out what came next. He wasn't just a lawyer, he was a strategist. He'd built his career on turning the tables, on finding the cracks in corrupt systems and breaking them open. Grayson didn't know it, but he'd just picked a fight with the wrong man. By noon, word of the incident had spread beyond the courthouse walls. Ellison's small black community, long accustomed to Grayson's heavy-handed rulings, buzzed with outrage. A local activist, Tanya Brooks, was already outside, rallying a small crowd. "This is what they do," she shouted, her voice carrying through the open windows. "They fine us for existing, for speaking, for breathing." Tanya, a fiery 30-year-old with a megaphone and a law degree she couldn't afford to use, had been documenting Grayson's court for years. She knew his patterns, how black defendants often faced harsher fines, longer sentences, than their white counterparts. Marcus's case was just the latest, but it was also different. He wasn't a local struggling to pay a fine. He was a federal prosecutor, someone with power, someone who could fight back. Inside, Marcus caught Tanya's voice through the window and felt a surge of resolve. He wasn't alone in this. But he also knew the fight wouldn't be won with megaphones or protests alone. Grayson's power came from the bench, from the system that propped him up. To bring him down, Marcus would need to use the system against him. The breaking point came that afternoon. Grayson, emboldened by the morning's unchallenged dominance, called Marcus back to the stand. "Mr. Wright," he said, his tone dripping with mockery, "you got anything else to say, or are you done wasting my time?" The courtroom stilled. Every eye was on Marcus. He stood, buttoning his suit jacket, his movements deliberate. "Your Honor," he began, his voice low but resonant, "I've said all I need to for now. But you should know that I've already contacted the U.S. Attorney's Office. They're very interested in what's happening here today." The room erupted. Grayson's gavel pounded, but it couldn't drown out the murmurs. "Order," he shouted, his face now a deep shade of crimson. "You think you can threaten me? I'll have you in cuffs." Marcus didn't flinch. "I'm not threatening, Your Honor. I'm informing. The Department of Justice takes judicial misconduct seriously. Especially when it involves racial bias." The word racial landed like a grenade. Grayson froze, his mouth half open. For the first time, uncertainty flickered in his eyes. Marcus pressed on, his voice rising just enough to carry to the back of the room. "I've spent my career upholding the law, ensuring justice is blind. But what I've seen here today isn't justice. It's prejudice. And it's not just about might, it's about every person who stood in this courtroom and been silenced because of who they are." The young woman with the notebook was now on her feet, nodding vigorously. Tanya's chants outside grew louder, syncing with Marcus's words. The air was electric, the tension a living thing. Grayson recovered, his voice booming. "You're out of line. $500 more for contempt, and I'm recommending your disbarment." But the threat felt hollow. The reporters in the room were typing furiously, their phones already pinging with notifications. Marcus's words had lit a spark, and it was spreading fast. He sat down, his heart pounding but his face calm. He'd planted the seed. Now it was time to let it grow. Outside, Tanya's crowd had doubled in size. Social media was ablaze with Ellison Injustice, a hashtag Tanya had coined within minutes of hearing about Marcus's fine. Clips of the courtroom exchange, recorded by a bold spectator, were already circulating on X. The local news van pulled up, its crew scrambling to catch the growing protest. Marcus, still inside, didn't know the full extent of it yet, but he could feel the shift. The system Grayson relied on was starting to crack. By evening, the U.S. Attorney's Office had been alerted. Marcus's call wasn't a bluff. His colleagues in Atlanta were already pulling records on Grayson's rulings, cross-referencing data for patterns of bias. Tanya's documentation, years of meticulous notes on disparate sentencing, was about to find a wider audience. The young woman in the courtroom, a law student named Aisha, had emailed her professor, a civil rights attorney with connections to the ACLU. The pieces were falling into place. Grayson, meanwhile, was unraveling. He dismissed court early, retreating to his chambers, but the weight of his actions followed him. He'd underestimated Marcus, assuming he was just another black man he could bully into silence. Now, with the media sniffing around and the Justice Department looming, he was starting to sweat. He'd ruled Ellison's courthouse like a king for decades, his biases unchallenged, his power absolute. But Marcus Wright wasn't just a lawyer. He was a reckoning. The next morning, the courthouse was packed. Word had spread overnight, and people from neighboring towns had joined Tanya's protest. Aisha was there, her notebook now a weapon, filled with quotes from Marcus's stand. The media presence had grown. National outlets had picked up the story, drawn by the viral clips and the hashtag. Marcus walked in, his expression unreadable but his stride purposeful. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for Aisha, for Tanya, for every person who'd ever felt the sting of a system that judged them before they spoke. Grayson took the bench, his face pale but his jaw set. He tried to reclaim control, banging his gavel before the room could settle. "We're here to address the contempt fines issued yesterday," he said, his voice tight. "Mr. Wright, you have one chance to apologize and pay, or I'll escalate this further." Marcus stood, his eyes never leaving Grayson's. "I won't apologize for speaking truth, Your Honor. And I won't pay a dime for your prejudice." The room exploded. Cheers mixed with boos, and Grayson's gavel was useless against the chaos. Tanya's voice carried from outside, "No justice, no peace." Aisha was live tweeting, her fingers flying. The reporters were on their feet, cameras rolling. Marcus felt the weight of every eye, every voice, every story that had led to this moment. He wasn't just a prosecutor now. He was a symbol. The courtroom was a powder keg, and Marcus Wright had just struck the match. Judge Harold Grayson's gavel pounded uselessly against the uproar, his authority slipping like sand through his fingers. Marcus stood unwavering, his words, "I won't apologize for speaking truth, Your Honor. And I won't pay a dime for your prejudice," still reverberating through the room. The crowd's cheers drowned out Grayson's shouts for order, and Tanya's chants from outside bled through the walls, "No justice, no peace." Aisha, the law student, typed furiously, her live tweets already trending under Ellison injustice. Reporters scrambled, their cameras capturing every second of the chaos. Marcus felt the weight of the moment, not just for himself but for every person who'd ever been silenced in this courtroom. Grayson's face was a mask of fury, but beneath it, Marcus saw something new, fear. The judge wasn't used to being challenged, not like this. For decades, he'd ruled Ellison County with an iron fist, his biases unchecked, his rulings final. But Marcus wasn't a local defendant scraping by, unable to fight back. He was a federal prosecutor, a man who dismantled corrupt officials from Atlanta to D.C. And he wasn't alone. The U.S. Attorney's Office was already moving, their investigation into Grayson's record gaining steam. Tanya's years of documentation, case after case of disproportionate fines and sentences for black defendants had been emailed to Marcus's colleagues overnight. Aisha's professor had looped in the ACLU, and their legal team was drafting a complaint. The walls were closing in. Grayson tried to regain control. "This is my courtroom," he bellowed, his voice cracking. "You will sit down, Mr. Wright, or I'll have you removed." But the threat felt hollow. The reporters were now streaming live, their feeds picked up by national outlets. The crowd outside had swelled to hundreds, their signs demanding "justice for Marcus" and "end bias now." Tanya, her megaphone blaring, led a chant that shook the courthouse windows. Marcus remained standing, his posture calm but unyielding. "With all due respect, Your Honor," he said, his voice cutting through the noise, "this isn't about your courtroom. It's about the law. And the law doesn't bend to prejudice." The room erupted again. A white man in the back, one of the locals who'd smirked at Marcus the day before, stood and stormed out, muttering under his breath. But others stayed, their faces a mix of awe and anger. Aisha's eyes shone with determination as she scribbled Marcus's words, her notebook a testament to the moment. The young woman's professor had arrived, whispering to a colleague about filing an emergency motion to suspend Grayson's rulings. Marcus caught her eye and gave a slight nod. He wasn't fighting alone anymore. Grayson, desperate to reassert dominance, made a fatal mistake. "You think you can come into my town and make a spectacle, he spat, leaning over the bench. I've seen your kind before, thinking you're above the rest of us. I'm doubling the fine $1,000 for contempt, and I'm reporting you to the state bar. The words were meant to intimidate, but they backfired. The crowd's outrage reached a fever pitch, and even the bailiff, a stoic man who'd served Grayson for years, hesitated, his hand hovering over his cuffs. Marcus didn't blink. Report me, he said, his voice steady. But you might want to check your own record first. The Justice Department is already doing it. The mention of the Justice Department was a sledgehammer. Grayson froze, his mouth half open, as the reality sank in. He'd underestimated Marcus, assuming his title was a bluff, a shield to hide behind. But Marcus's credentials were real, and the weight of his position was now a spotlight on Grayson's every move. The judge slumped back in his chair, his hands trembling slightly. For the first time in decades, he looked small. Outside, the protest had grown into a movement. Tanya had coordinated with activists from neighboring counties, and buses were arriving with supporters. The local news van was now joined by CNN and MSNBC, their reporters interviewing Tanya and other locals who'd faced Grayson's wrath. One woman, a black single mother named Carla, tearfully recounted how Grayson had fined her $500 for a minor traffic violation, forcing her to choose between rent and food. Her story, amplified by the cameras, went viral within hours. Ellison Injustice was no longer just a hashtag, it was a rallying cry. Inside, Marcus sat down, his point made. He knew the real battle wasn't in this courtroom anymore. It was in the data his colleagues were compiling, in the stories Tanya and others were sharing, in the legal motions Aisha's professor was drafting. But Grayson wasn't done. In a last-ditch effort to save face, he called a recess and retreated to his chambers, slamming the door. The courtroom buzzed as people whispered, speculated, and planned. Marcus leaned over to Aisha, who'd approached him with her notebook. "Keep writing," he said quietly. "This isn't over." She nodded, her eyes fierce. "I'm with you," she whispered. The recess lasted an hour, but it felt like an eternity. When Grayson returned, his demeanor had shifted. The bluster was gone, replaced by a forced calm. He cleared his throat, avoiding Marcus's gaze. "After review," he said, his voice strained, "I'm rescinding the contempt fines against Mr. Wright. This court will proceed with the scheduled cases." A murmur of disbelief rippled through the room. It wasn't an apology, but it was a crack in Grayson's armor. Marcus didn't smile. He knew this was only the beginning. That evening, the U.S. Attorney's Office issued a statement. They were launching a formal investigation into Judge Harold Grayson's conduct, focusing on allegations of racial bias in his rulings. Tanya's documentation, combined with Marcus's testimony and Aisha's recordings, provided a damning case. The ACLU filed a federal lawsuit the next day, naming Grayson in Ellison County for systemic discrimination. Social media exploded, with Ellison Injustice trending worldwide. Carla's story, along with others, painted a picture of a town where justice had been twisted for too long. Grayson's downfall came swiftly. Within a week, the State Judicial Oversight Board suspended him pending investigation. The evidence was overwhelming: decades of disproportionate rulings, fines, and sentences targeting black defendants. Tanya's notes, meticulously cross-referenced with court records, showed a pattern so blatant it couldn't be ignored. Marcus testified before the board, his voice steady as he recounted not just his own experience but the stories he'd heard from Carla, Tanya, and others. Aisha's professor presented the ACLU's findings, citing case law that left no room for Grayson's defense. The final blow came when a retired bailiff, a white man who'd served under Grayson for 20 years, came forward. He admitted to witnessing Grayson's biased first-hand comments made off the record, rulings skewed by race, a culture of fear that kept dissenters silent. The bailiff's testimony, aired on national news, sealed Grayson's fate. He resigned in disgrace, his legacy reduced to a cautionary tale. Marcus didn't celebrate. Victory felt heavy, tempered by the knowledge of how many had suffered before him. He met with Tanya and Aisha outside the courthouse the day Grayson's resignation was announced. The crowd was smaller now, but the energy was electric. "This is for all of us," Tanya said, her voice thick with emotion. Aisha hugged Marcus, her notebook tucked under her arm. "You gave us a voice," she said. Marcus shook his head. "You already had it. I just helped you be heard." Ellison County began to change. A new judge, a woman of color with a reputation for fairness, was appointed to replace Grayson. Tanya started a non-profit to monitor local courts, funded by donations that poured in after the story broke. Aisha, inspired by Marcus, applied to clerk for a federal judge, her sights set on a career in civil rights law. Carla's fines were refunded, and she joined Tanya's organization, determined to help others. Marcus returned to his work in Atlanta, but he carried Ellison with him. He'd always known the system wasn't perfect, but now he saw his role differently. It wasn't enough to prosecute cases, he had to challenge the structures that allowed men like Grayson to thrive. He started mentoring young lawyers like Aisha, sharing his story to inspire them. The fire in his chest hadn't died, it had grown, fueled by the knowledge that justice wasn't a gift but a fight. The story of Ellison spread far beyond Georgia. It sparked debates on X, in classrooms, and at dinner tables. Was Grayson an outlier, or was he a symptom of a deeper problem? Could one man's stand really change a system? People shared their own experience of bias, of silence, of fighting back. The conversation grew, messy and raw, but vital. What do you think? Where does justice begin, and how do we confront the conflicts that divide us?